talking to Professor Lauren Selden, who has me curious to ask, how do you teach? You're with the SFA School of Art, and I'm wondering how you teach in your specialty, which is metals and jewelry, when you're having to teach remotely online.
Yes, it's a challenge because we're a really tool-heavy course, and also we utilize the facilities a lot for safety. So we work with fire almost every day. So this has been a challenge. I would say that the first really beneficial thing for me in my field is that I've always been an active member of our international organization for metalworking and jewelry. And they created a Zoom meeting immediately when we thought that we could possibly be shut down. So the first thing that happened was I was part of a Zoom meeting with probably over 100 college professors from metalworking and jewelry. And it was the most positive, constructive. Everybody somehow had time to speak, ask questions. It was just exceptional to see a community like that right away. So, and then they immediately posted a couple of Facebook groups, which I haven't been very active on Facebook for years, but I followed and contributed to one Facebook group that was for college teaching of art as a full discipline, and then one that was for metalworking and jewelry. And people were sharing Google documents full of resources. People have been sharing their demonstrations and videos. Many people were sharing even down to things like how to photograph your work from an iPhone. Because we knew that, or from a phone period, because we knew that all of our documentation from this point forward was going to have to be from a phone. So I think that was the best setup that I had to get started. So our first Zoom meetings with all of my classes, so I taught Intro to Metals and Jewelry, Advanced Metals and Jewelry, and then a Professional Practices class for all art majors. In my first class, my number one thing was to set up communication. So I asked all of them how they would like to communicate. And we have been using D2L in our courses, but generally for grading. So with the Professional Practices course, we used it a lot because we were building documents. But with the jewelry classes, we mainly used it for grading, resources, project guidelines, things like that. So they agreed that they wanted to use D2L. They are Brightspace. They agreed that they would be checking their emails, but that wasn't the best form of communication for them. So everything went through D2L. We did, and then we organized when we were going to have our Zoom meetings. And then we organized another app that they like to use, which is GroupMe. And it's mainly, they just like to just chat with each other, and they were doing that before me, so they just invited me. So that was the most important thing to get us started, I think, was how are we going to communicate with each other? And really finding out individually from the students what their individual situation was on the internet accessibility. So each one of the classes, I had multiple students that we would have to do a couple of different things to keep them involved, but to work around remote internet access.
In the absence of the equipment and materials and safety facilities that you usually have to work with, have the students been able to continue to actually make jewelry?
Yes, they have. So I think, again, by having that community of other makers to kind of discuss this with, some classes and even some classes at SFA, they ended up sending kits of tools right away. The time period that we were in the curriculum for all of my classes, it would have been a pretty big shakeup to send tools to be able to work with even low-tech things. So I didn't go that route. So the way that I was dealing with it was I've been trying to stay as positive as possible and to keep everybody really calm. And so what I explained to them is that as a metalworking and jewelry artist and as a sculptor myself, I've traveled all over the world, and generally every place that I've traveled has not had equipment for working with metal. and they have not had safety equipment. And so what I explained to my students is that we can really utilize this as a time to still be good designers, to still be good makers, but to use the things we have around us. So I gave them multiple project prompts. Sometimes they would include sketching and design prompts as well. And I gave them really kind of small goals those first weeks. So the first week, they simply needed to set up a space, any space that they considered their studio. And so that actually came from, I went into my daughter's preschool class before all this started. And my daughter said to one of her classmates, you know, a 4-year-old, she said, "Oh, well, my mom and I made that in our studio." And the 4-year-old said, "Well, what is a studio?" And my daughter said, "It's a place where you make art." And the little girl was sitting just at a folding table kind of, and she was painting. And she said, "So this is my studio." And then we said, "Well, yeah, that's your studio." You know, so I explained that to the students that, you know, throughout my time, I've had levels of paranoia about how low tech my own studio is. And then the more artists that I meet, you know, we have a friend that's at New York City who's one of the most prominent metalworking and jewelry people, and her studio was like a table next to her bed, you know. And so their first week, all they did is gather materials, anything that they had, paint. I told them, don't go out, don't order stuff, you know, anything that you have. So they would put paper, plastic materials, cutting device, you know, scissors, anything like that, bring it to their table or their space that was going to be their studio space. And we started from there. And then the next week we would do, you know, kind of prompts to kind of start building that work. We met on Zoom so that we could help each other out, and students could say, "Oh, I like the direction that you're going, but do you have any cardboard? Because cardboard seems like it could add to that." So one of the first prompts was to replicate a historic jewelry piece. And most of the, you know, you've probably seen postings that most of the museums have made their archives extremely accessible during this time. So I gave them 3 or 4 different places, Victoria and Albert and other museums that had their archives really, really accessible. So they could just take a piece of jewelry and then they could replicate it. And I was hoping that would give them the ability to already have a design there and then replicate it, whether it's with cardboard or leaves or any number of materials. And then their other prompt was much more open, that it was using those materials, but then responding to what is currently happening in their life. And most of them actually went that way, which is much more abstract. But then, yeah, so they're creating. So here and there, we'd have students that really were struggling to get going. But I think because we were constantly meeting as a group and we were constantly working as a team, I think that helped. And we also had journal entries every week that they would post on the discussion board on Brightspace. And I participated in all of this as well. So while I'm still doing school stuff and graduate committees and whatever I'm doing, I was still making artwork specifically and still making masks for people. And I would document those things, put those in a journal so that they could see a format for how to explain what's going on during a given week. And so we've done that every single week. So they would read through each other's journals. Then we'd be able to discuss in person to try to give each other better ideas for the next work.
You mentioned that, you know, the museums have made things available, and there really have been a number of things that have been quite positive in the arts that have been available. And your last comment about the type of work that they've been doing makes me wonder if there's been any positive aspect to the need, or perhaps the desire to do more conceptual, theoretical, intellectual work in the absence of all the tools and materials and equipment and so forth?
Yeah. So, you know, these are still concepts that we deal with all the time in jewelry, and there are certainly plenty of jewelries out there that work in isolation, you know, but we also talk a lot about collaborative work in art, which is tricky right now. So I have 2 students that that were separated from each other and created a collaborative work together. And so even though the other student isn't in my class, we invited her to the critique so that they could talk about this collaborative work and they could get criticism from, you know, people in the field and say, "Oh, well, have you thought about a better way to connect the work with images, or have you thought about a performative aspect so that we know that you're for sure in different locations doing this body of work? So we're almost more able to speak about the abstract side of things and the concept side of things, because when we're in the classroom, and I've always struggled with this as a metals teacher, when we're in the classroom, it is so difficult to stop talking about the technical things, so when I teach other fields of art, it's so much easier for me because I can just talk all about the content and the design. But with metals and jewelry, I still always have to mention, well, you didn't get it hot enough, and that's the reason why this, so it's actually easier to speak in broader abstract concepts like that. So I think in that respect, it's really positive. I also think from the respect of sharing, at least in my experience of this, where everybody's trying to do the best for their students as we can, I was so grateful to see so much sharing. And I was also grateful to see that I feel like the fine arts in general are critical to society. And it became obvious right away when singers were giving free concerts, actors were doing free work, dancers were doing collaborative Zoom, dances and editing them together. And then artists were doing mock master works everywhere, and so there's this immediate grab to this culture that we're creating. And I think that it's a good reminder for our students that they're part of that culture now. And this thing that's critical to who human beings are. Some of the first things we saw out of Italy was singing. So for me, I think it's that reminder of where we are. I was trying to be a place for them to, we really focused on just make things, take risks. It might be the worst thing you've ever made. Document it in a journal. Show us what you're doing, because that's something that we also don't have as much of a chance to do while in our art classes. But as an artist, many of the things that you're doing are duds. It's not an expectation that every single thing that you make needs to be in the gallery. But the way academia is set up, it makes the students feel like that's a realistic goal. So for me, this is an excellent time to say, I'm not grading on craftsmanship or finishing or quality at all. I just want you to work. So when you're feeling nervous about what's going on, or you're, find 2 hours in the day, try a new technique that you've never tried before. And then they would, continue to ask me if they were stuck on things.
Yeah, it's certainly has brought to the front of everyone's mind how important the arts are, really, to contemplate the possibility of this social distancing without music or without film, or without novels to read, and without the visual arts as well. Can you talk a little more about what the implications have been for the professional practices course? Again, maybe there's even a positive aspect of needing to get good at the technology to display one's own work.
Yeah. So, I'm really, I teach that professional practices class in a really challenging way. It is a lot of paperwork. I make sure that every single thing that they do is not busy work. It's all stuff that they would need in order to get a job. And so one of the things that's the most challenging about art is that no matter what you make, your work is being represented by a digital image, no matter what. So as a sculptor, my work isn't finished until I've taken an extremely well-documented image of that work that then will represent me. So the thing that I find that's interesting, we're working on cover letters, resumes, CVs, portfolios, image lists. We also need to cover how to set up an exhibition. So in that class, we set up a gallery exhibition. We cover how to make your own labels, how to make your own text panels, all of these things, how to ship your work, how to pack your work, how to frame. It's just, and then how to give an artist presentation, mock interviews. So it is an intense amount of information in one semester. So the benefit of this whole thing is that I have had almost all of that on D2L, because the way that I teach it is It was based on a graduate level course, which was also based on a PhD level course, where you create a document and then everybody peer reviews it over and over and over and over again. And so all of that is accessible to them through the discussion tables. The benefit is that when they graduate, I always explain they're a team of however many are in that class, 15 people or something, that are looking at these documents so closely and that are talking about the design of these documents, that you could save and download all of these documents so that then when you go to do your real job interview, you can look through and say, oh boy, I really liked how Michaela designed her resume. I might look at that again. And so this is a heavy, heavy, heavy course. So we had done, the only negative is that our plan was to set up Texas National and work with the preparator. And so we did miss that. The good news is that we had already done much of that physical work at SFA before the classes left. So we were able to do labels and to set up work in the gallery. And so they did get that experience, but they would have gotten really great experience at the Cole Art Center and seeing how professional artists pack their work and ship their work. So that's the only real negative that we missed. I have worked with Jamie Bolden for years at the Career Services Office, and we had scheduled in January to do mock interviews. So I'm very lucky that that happened, because that office has been swamped, with work. They've done a great job. So we still went ahead and did Zoom interviews with all of our students. And that, I think, is one of the things that it takes so much time from the people that I asked to do the interviews, but it's one of the most exceptional experiences. And I was really nervous about doing these interviews this year because I'm watching unemployment go up and I'm concerned about the situation that we're in. And Jamie and I talked about it, and we both said, now more than ever, it's important that they know interview strategies so that when these jobs come up, they'll be ready to go. So we were able to go through those interviews with them. We also were able to talk to them about specifics of your background, what you wear, avoiding being in a chair that spins the whole time, things like that. So, and they still took it extremely seriously. They all dressed up. They had previously given me job descriptions, which I created individual questions for each of their interviews. So those are the things that I think were super successful. Their artist lecture, we just finished their artist lecture, which they presented on Zoom by sharing their screen. And I think that they did a great job. So I think most of that translated really well. I think if anything, that was the class that I didn't really let up on the speed of it, because I just had kept them prepped the whole semester. We're doing this, and then we're doing this. So on the other classes, I think that I was much, I would kind of take away a lot more of that stress. And I think with that professional practices class, it was like, let's keep driving it home. It's okay that, you got this project late, but we got to keep going, So they have just turned in all of their documents again that have all been edited. And, I think that's such a fun class to teach. But it is probably the hardest at this time for me to say goodbye to some of them that are graduating and think, "Ooh, I just hope everything works out okay for them." I'm just always worried about them and thinking about them.
Yeah, no one knows anything looking
I know.
do we? Thank you for taking the time to talk with us about all that you've done to keep the teaching and learning and art making going during this time. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wanted to say about what you've been doing?
Maybe the things that I was pleasantly surprised with that I would do again. I would say that the things that I perhaps, I don't know whether this was effective or not. First of all, it's kind of hard to tell at this stage. They did make work, but in the whole scheme of things, I don't know how effective it was. The main thing that I was hoping to do is to give them a place where they could meet. They still needed that. That was pretty obvious. One of my classes is big into playing games. And so I built multiple Zoom games that were metals and jewelry related. So we played Jeopardy and we played Scattergories, and they got to argue with each other, which was great, So those things I think were successful. The things that I wouldn't mind doing in the future, Uh, One, I think that office hours on Zoom were actually much more effective than in person, at least in my couple of experiences. And I'm not certain whether that's just that um, both people are in an environment that they're comfortable with, and so they were much more open to communicate. I'm not sure what that was, but I think both of us just felt a little bit more comfortable just being in our own studio space or home space and just trying to figure out what we needed to do. So I thought advising on Zoom would be a nice option for the future, and especially for those students that maybe don't live on campus, and that's not remotely a convenient way to meet with somebody anyway. So I think I would continue that in the future. The other thing that I think that I've known for years that I need to continue is that when we get back in person, I hope that I can record every lecture that I do and then immediately place those on Brightspace. I probably won't place all of them out in the public sphere, but just for my own students so that they can be much more mature about their decisions about coming. Because with art, it is so critical that they're there every single day. And I don't think it's a flaw on their side that if they have a little cough or something, they're going to come to class, but we share every single tool. So I think one of the big things is that I think it's very possible to do on-site learning and remote learning. There'll probably always be a learning curve on being able to trust each other on the information that we're getting about why they're there or why they aren't there. But I think trying to keep as much of those resources on Brightspace as well as the in-person resources. Certainly, I think in person is the way that we have to go because there are some major detriments of not being together. But I do think that those are some things that I'd like to do in the future is to keep those aspects going. We also had multiple graduate students finish their MFA, and they're some of our most talented students, and they did an excellent job. I've worked with them on their thesis writing and their lectures and all of those things, but they both figured out a really clever way to do remote exhibitions. Our undergraduate BFA students also had to figure out a way to do an online Bfa Exhibition because that's part of their capstone. And so they've figured out really neat ways. I had a student that posted images on social distancing gallery sites that have already been set up. Some people had to create their own websites or their own video representation of their show. And our two MFAs that have gone so far, their public lectures were exceptional. And the benefit, again, of Zoom is that, both of those students were from Mexico. Their entire families were able to see their lectures. So I do hope that in our near future that we always make Zoom an option for those public lectures so that friends and family can go. So one of those graduate students was somebody that I've worked with the whole time, and my parents, who adored him, came to his lecture, which wouldn't have happened if it was just on site. So I do think that there's some things that we're learning that are beneficial that can also, and we had so many alumni that came to their lectures where it was just wonderful. So you just kind of like zoom through and like, oh my gosh, that's so great. There they are, So I hope that we keep that as a permanent fixture. There's always so much to do, but I hope that we can keep that as a permanent fixture. It's just a really wonderful way to keep our SFA alum together.
Yeah, thanks. It's inspiring to think about the things that we've kind of been required to do that really have been value added to some of the things that we're used to. As much as we're looking forward to getting back together in person, there are things that, we really should adopt and continue to do from this technologically mediated way of working.
The other, one other thing about the professional practices class that came up in the interviews that I think can be a positive is that, we asked a question, how do you most like to communicate with people that you work with? And they all said, I think face-to-face communication is the most effective because emails could be misunderstood, et cetera. And I mentioned to all of my students that, you now, although this has been challenging, you now have this as part of who you are that nobody will forget. So when you're in a job interview, you can now say, well, it's funny you mentioned that because I was finishing my college degree during COVID-19. And so although I like to work face to face, I'm also aware that sometimes I might need to do that by Zoom, or I might need to do that in, some kind of group social application, so I think kind of constantly reminding each other that we might be in a new type of world, and we're trying to help our students adapt and move to those things. And I think that's what something that the fine arts do an exceptional job at, is that we're teaching our people to just think creatively, problem solve, and then adapt. I think we're good adapters, and I do think that that's what's gonna keep coming for the rest of our lives, probably, is just this constant need to adapt.
Well, of course, I'm inclined to agree, and I'm certainly inclined to agree that uh, the artists, are great problem solvers. That's one of the things that creativity is all about. Really appreciate your creativity and really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today about it.
Thank you so much.